In the vast northern reaches of the American continent lies a land shaped by glaciers, forged through conflict and unified by resilience. A land where mammoth hunters once roamed icy plains, where indigenous nations thrived for millennia before the first whisper of European sails. It is a sweeping SOG, one of survival and adaptation, fierce independence and quiet revolution, of indigenous wisdom and colonial ambition. Here, the bones of ancient buffalo rest beneath modern skyscrapers, and the chants of old trade songs echo beneath the thunder of urban trains. This is not merely the history of a country, it is the epic of a continent's northern soul. This is Canada. Canada's story is not just one of maple leaves and snow-capped mountains. From the first human footprints across the Bering Land Bridge to the rise of mighty, indigenous confederacies, from the fur traders and voyageurs who mapped wild rivers to the distant drums of war that shook, Quebec and Acadia, Canada has always been a place of intersecting journeys. Archaeological sites like Bluefish Caves in the Yukon and Buttermilk Creek in Texas hint at the deep antiquity of their presence over 14,000 years ago. These weren't transient wanderers. They were the ancestors of today's indigenous peoples, the architects of a long and rich cultural lineage. Their complex clan-based societies revolved around fishing, artistry, and the potlatcha ceremonial gift-giving feast that symbolized wealth, status, and social ties. Each chapter peels back the layers of this vast nation's past, revealing moments of triumph, tragedy, resistance, and renewal. And with it, the cultural complexity of indigenous societies grew. Obsidian from the Rockies made its way to the prairies. Copper from the Great Lakes reached the East Coast. Ideas of astronomy, medicine, and governance were shared through sacred stories and seasonal gatherings. Distinct nations formed each with its own language, governance, spiritual beliefs, and trade systems. They had heard tales of a fertile land beyond the icy sea. What they found was a place they called Vinland, rich in timber, wild grapes, and fish. It is a story not of wilderness, but of civilization, not of blank slates, but of sovereign nations. It was a small cluster of timber-framed buildings, iron forges, and ship repair stations, proof that the Norse not only explored these lands but briefly lived upon them. These early meetings were marked by both trade and conflict, and the Norse settlement at Lonso Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland would be short-lived. Using dogs and later horses introduced by Europeans, they tracked massive herds across the grasslands, developing tipis for shelter and intricate oral traditions to preserve history. Or perhaps the Norse simply lacked the imperial ambitions that would later drive Spain, France, and Britain across the ocean. Whatever the reason, the Norse withdrew, leaving only faint archaeological footprints behind. These were horticultural societies that mastered the Three Sisters agricultural system: corn, beans, and squash each crop, sustaining the others in a delicate ecological balance. The rich Atlantic fisheries drew seasonal fleets from England, Portugal, France, and Spain. Salt cod and whale oil soon became coveted resources across Europe. These early visits would lead to informal contact with indigenous groups along the coast, but colonization, at least for now, would have to wait. Why? This is a living, breathing chronicle of the people, the land, and the nation that became Canada. Vikings once stepped ashore here. French voyageurs carved paths into wilderness. British redcoats clashed with patriots. But whispers of Vinland would echo through Nordic memory and mapmaker legend, and from their legacy rose the Canada we know today. Complex, multicultural, and still evolving. What he found was the rich fishing grounds of the Grand Banks off Newfoundland. He claimed the territory for England, though he never set up permanent camps. In this 25-part journey, we will trace the entire history of Canada step by step. These Paleo-Indians were not mere nomads. They were pioneers, master survivalists, navigating a frozen, perilous world of megafauna in unpredictable climates. Prepare for ancient migrations and fierce alliances, for rebellion, federation, innovation, and identity. This isn't just a timeline. Long before borders were drawn, long before the names Canada, America, or New World ever entered the minds of explorers, this land teemed with life and civilization. The first peoples of Canada arrived during the last ice age, crossing the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia into Alaska and eventually spreading across North America. They followed herds of mammoths, caribou, and bison. Their knowledge of land, weather, and migration honed through generations. As the glaciers receded, the land transformed. Forests replaced tundra. Rivers flowed, carving paths into the shield and plains. On the Pacific coast, the ancestors of the Haida and Tlingit built sophisticated plank houses and crafted totem poles. In the plains, groups such as the Blackfoot and Cree developed mobile cultures, centered around the hunt of bison. Further east, along the St. Lawrence and Great Lakes, the ancestors of the Huron-Wendat and Iroquois Confederacy built fortified longhouse villages. These early cultures were not static. They traded goods and ideas across immense distances. This vast and interconnected tapestry of Indigenous life is Canada's true foundation. It predates colonization by thousands of years, long before Columbus set foot in the Caribbean, and centuries before Cartier sailed into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Another group of daring sailors glimpsed the shores of what we now call Canada, the Norse. Around the year 1000 CE, Norse explorers led by Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, ventured westward from Greenland. The sagas, those semi-mythical Norse oral histories, speak of encounters with a native people they called the Skrælings, likely ancestors of the Beothuk or other indigenous groups of Newfoundland and Labrador, yet its significance is monumental. L'Anse aux Meadows, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, represents the first known European settlement in North America, 5 centuries before Columbus. Still, the Norse did not stay. Their settlements did not evolve into colonies. Perhaps the climate proved too harsh. Perhaps the indigenous resistance was too strong. For the next 500 years, the indigenous peoples of Canada continued to thrive without European interference. Then, in 1497, a new chapter began. John Cabot, Italian sailing under the English flag, crossed the Atlantic in search of a westward route to Asia. With Cabot's voyage, the age of European exploration was underway. Canada was on the brink of its next transformation. By the dawn of the 16th century, whispers of a new land across the Atlantic had stirred Europe into a frenzy of exploration. While Spain carved empires in the south, France turned its gaze northward to the cold, mysterious shores that would become Canada. His mission was simple: discover a northwest passage to Asia and claim new lands for France. He planted a cross on the peninsula and claimed the territory for France. An act done without consent, though veiled in gestures of diplomacy, the seeds of colonization were sown. What he found instead were icy capes, deep river valleys, and thriving indigenous nations. There he encountered the fortified village of Stadacona, modern-day Quebec City on. Further upriver, the great settlement of Hochelaga, Montreal. He kidnapped the sons of the Stadaconan chief Donnacona and brought them back to France. Perched on a rocky promontory overlooking the St. Lawrence River, became the heart of New France. In 1541, he attempted a failed colonization near present-day Cap Rouge. This decision would shape the geopolitics of North America for centuries. Misery, disease, and conflict with indigenous communities forced the French to abandon their efforts, yet endured. Catholic missionaries, including Jesuits, journeyed deep into indigenous lands, seeking to convert souls but often documenting cultures with remarkable detail. Fur traders or coureurs de bois ventured ever westward, opening up the interior of the continent. These were not primitive camps, but advanced urban centers of their time. What began in under Champlain now spread along the river valleys, through dense forests and great lakes, riding on canoes filled with furs and dreams of empire. This economy depended on a sprawling network of alliances with indigenous nations. French traders ventured deep into the interior, guided by indigenous knowledge and relying on indigenous diplomacy. Entire villages were destroyed. In 1649, the Huron Confederacy collapsed under Iroquois' assault. Survivors scattered or sought refuge with other nations in French outposts. They lived among indigenous peoples, learning their languages, documenting customs, and preaching Christianity. They fortified their settlements, expanded trade routes farther west, and embraced diplomacy. It was still thinly populated and heavily dependent on indigenous relations, but its cultural and religious roots had taken hold. Explorers such as Radisson and Des Gros Saliers pushed into Hudson Bay. La Salle reached the Mississippi, claiming Louisiana for France. The Jesuit relations letters sent back to France remain some of the most detailed ethnographic records of early Canadian history. But missionary work was not without cost. Still, the colony grew through the introduction of the filles du roi, young women sent from France to balance the gender ratio and encourage settlement. Over 1,300 delegates from 39 indigenous nations gathered to sign a massive peace treaty with the French. It ended decades of warfare with the Haudenosaunee and opened a new chapter of relative stability in New France. These women would become the matriarchs of French Canada. In some cases, it fueled cultural tensions, inadvertently spreading European diseases that devastated indigenous communities. The Great Lakes became trade highways, linking peoples across thousands of kilometers. Yet during this gap, fishermen from Brittany and Normandy continued to visit the Atlantic shores, trading with indigenous peoples. He understood that survival in this new world required alliances, not conquest. But these were more than trading posts, were bastions of French culture and Catholic faith. First, especially beaver pelts became more valuable than gold. This laid the foundation for what would become Canada's first great economy, the fur trade. Fields, palisades, spiritual practices, indigenous civilization was strong and vibrant. In 1534, French explorer Jacques Cartier sailed into the Gulf of St. Lawrence under orders from King Francis I. On his first voyage, Cartier encountered the Micmac and the St. Lawrence Iroquoians. Cartier's second voyage in 1535 brought him up the mighty river he named the St. Lawrence. Yet Cartier, focused on gold and passageways, misunderstood the value before him. For nearly 70 years after Cartier, French colonization paused. Then, in 1603, Samuel de Champlain arrived. More than an explorer, Champlain was a mapmaker, soldier, and diplomat. In Etienne-l'Île-by-Ligne-Bas, Champlain founded the first permanent French settlement in North America. Champlain allied with the Huron-Wendat, Algonquin, and Innu nations, agreeing to support them in their long-standing conflicts against the powerful Haudenosaunee Confederacy to the south. These early colonial years were fragile. French settlers, known as habitants, braved brutal winters, crop failures, and attacks. This was not yet a colony in the modern sense. It was a trading post wrapped in faith and exploration. But it was growing. New France had begun. As the 17th century unfolded, New France moved from fragile foothold to ambitious frontier. The lifeblood of New France was the fur trade, particularly the beaver pelt, used in Europe to make fashionable and waterproof felt hats. And later, Ville Marie in 1642, soon to become Montreal. Missionaries, especially Jesuits, were at the heart of French expansion. Meanwhile, the Iroquois Wars raged. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, skilled, organized, and well-armed through English and Dutch trade, launched, sustained, attacks against the Huron-Wendat and other French allies. Yet the French adapted. Population growth remained slow. Unlike the English colonies to the south, New France had strict rules on immigration, religious conformity, and land ownership. In 1701, a moment of peace emerged, the Great Peace of Montreal. At the dawn of the 18th century, New France was vast, stretching from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes and south to the Mississippi. A new conflict, however, was brewing, one that would pit France against Britain in a contest that would decide the fate of North America. As New France grew in ambition and reach, so too did the shadow of conflict. Across the Atlantic, France and Britain vied not only for European dominance, but for control over the New World. Their colonies in North America, New France, and the 13 colonies became chess pieces in a global imperial game. While the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 had momentarily calmed tensions, it had profound consequences for New France. France ceded vast territories to Britain, Newfoundland, Acadia, and the Hudson Bay region. Though Quebec and the St. Lawrence Valley remained in French hands, the loss of Acadia exposed vulnerabilities and weakened French influence in the Maritimes. The Acadian people, descendants of early French settlers, now found themselves under British rule. The British promised religious freedom and cultural autonomy, but they also demanded loyalty to the crown. Many Acadians refused to take an unconditional oath of allegiance. The British, suspicious of Acadian neutrality, began to see them as a threat, particularly as tensions with France grew. Meanwhile, both empires maneuvered for influence in the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes region. But in Canada, its stakes were immediate and local. It was a war for survival. The British courted the powerful Haudenosaunee Confederacy, maintained a policy of strategic neutrality, but leaned toward British alignment. Forts fell and rose again. Skirmishes turned to sieges. French General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, a veteran of European warfare, took command in New France. And Canadian militia repelled British advances at Fort Carillon and harried their supply lines. But the tide was turning. Opposing him was the ambitious British general James Wolfe. The French built a chain of forts from Lake Erie to the Mississippi to secure their trade routes and check British expansion. Montcalm held firm, confident that the city's cliffs and walls would protect it. But on the morning of September 13th, Wolfe made his move. Under the cover of darkness, British troops scaled the cliffs west of the city and assembled on the Plains of Abraham. British settlers, driven by population pressure, began pushing westward, violating agreements with indigenous nations and threatening French trade networks. In 1758, they captured Louisbourg, a vital fortress guarding the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It was a seismic shift for the people of Canada, especially the Canadians. The French-speaking population now under British rule. With the seaway open, the British launched their final assault. It was a powder keg. Hostilities erupted into a series of frontier skirmishes that evolved into the larger conflict known in North America as the French and Indian War, and globally as the 7 Years' War. France ceded nearly all of its North American holdings to Britain. What remained was a Caribbean colony, Guadeloupe, valued more by France for its sugar than all of Canada. Indigenous nations played crucial roles on both sides. The French, long allied with the Huron, Algonquin, and Anishinaabe, drew on deep-rooted diplomatic and kinship ties. In 1755, the British made a fateful decision. They began the forced deportation of the Acadians in what would become known as the Great Upheaval. Over 10,000 Acadians were expelled from their lands, many dying in exile. Others resettled in Louisiana, where their descendants would become the Cajuns. By the mid-1750s, the stage was set for a full-scale war. Two empires. Dozens of indigenous nations. A continent's future hanging in the balance. The 7 Years' War was not just a battle for North America, it was the first truly global war stretching across Europe, the Caribbean, India, and the seas between. From 1756 onward, British and French forces clashed across Canada's wilderness. At first, the French held their ground. Montcalm's troops, alongside indigenous warriors Britain, poured resources into the war, deploying powerful naval forces to cut off French reinforcements. In 1759, General Wolfe sailed up the St. Lawrence with over 170 ships and thousands of men, his target. For weeks, Wolfe laid siege to the fortified city. The battle that followed was brief but decisive. Both Wolfe and Montcalm were mortally wounded, but the British prevailed. The heart of New France had been captured. In 1760, Montreal surrendered without a fight, and by 1763, the Treaty of Paris ended the war. New France was no more. The fleur-de-lis was lowered, the Union Jack raised. But the conquest was not merely a transfer of flags. Would they assimilate? Would they rebel? Would their language and culture survive? And what of the indigenous nations who had allied with the French nations now left to face a new colonial master? The British had won the land. But the battle for the soul of Canada had only just begun. With the Treaty of Paris signed in 1763, the British Crown now held dominion over a vast new territory, the former lands of New France. Yet possession of land was not the same as control. It established English civil law, mandated Protestant governance, and banned Catholic participation in public office. It also drew a proclamation line along the Appalachian Mountains, reserving lands west of that line for indigenous nations. On paper, this was meant to prevent settler encroachment and soothe indigenous tensions. The British faced a daunting challenge: what to do with a population of over 60,000 French-speaking Roman Catholics. In a web of indigenous nations whose alliances and grievances would not vanish with the signature, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 was Britain's first attempt to impose order. It redrew colonial boundaries, renaming New France the province of Quebec. In practice, it satisfied no one. It also expanded Quebec's borders into the Ohio Valley, alarming the American colonies to the south. Led by the Odawa chief Pontiac, warriors from multiple nations including the Ojibwe, Delaware, and Shawnee attacked British forts across the frontier. To Canadians, it was a reprieve, a signal that their language, religion, and identity might survive under British rule. Just 1 year later, in 1775, revolution would erupt in the 13 colonies, and Canada would once again be caught in the crossfire of empire. Would its French-speaking population support the crown that had conquered them? Or would they join the American revolutionaries seeking liberty and independence? Though ultimately unsuccessful in expelling the British, the uprising forced London to recognize Indigenous agency and the cost of ignoring treaties. The French Canadians feared forced assimilation and loss of their religious freedom. The British, aided by local militia and loyalist Canadians, repelled the attack. Montgomery was killed and Arnold wounded. British merchants newly arrived in Quebec resented the slow pace of Anglicization. Instead, they met resistance and indifference. Indigenous nations, especially those in the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley, saw the proclamation's promises ignored almost immediately by land-hungry settlers. Among them were black loyalists, enslaved and free Africans, who had been promised freedom in exchange for loyalty to the British. Many settled in Nova Scotia, facing harsh conditions and broken promises. Yet forming the roots of Canada's black communities, the spark of Indigenous resistance came swiftly. The British faced a new dilemma: how to govern two distinct populations, divided by language, religion, and legal tradition. In 1763, a powerful Indigenous uprising, known as Pontiac's War, erupted. These refugees brought with them not only English language and culture, but political expectations, rooted in British constitutional traditions. A delicate balance had been struck, but also a formal division of the country along cultural lines. Meanwhile, within Quebec, the British came to a practical realization. Complete assimilation of the French Canadians was unrealistic and potentially destabilizing. The American rebels, mostly Protestant and English-speaking, inspired suspicion. And after decades of imperial upheaval, many Canadians were cautious, preferring the known burdens of British rule to the uncertain promises of revolution. Many British officials, especially Governor Guy Carleton, began to advocate for accommodation rather than suppression. This culminated in the Quebec Act of 1774, a landmark moment in Canadian legal history. The act restored French civil law for private matters, confirmed the free practice of Catholicism, and granted rights to the Catholic clergy. To British colonists, the Quebec Act seemed like a betrayal, but the act would have unexpected consequences. As the fires of rebellion spread through the 13 colonies, the British colony of Quebec, formerly New France, found itself walking a tightrope. In 1775, the Revolution reached Canada's doorstep. American forces, led by General Richard Montgomery and a young Benedict Arnold, launched an ambitious invasion of Quebec. They hoped the Canadians would rise up in solidarity. Montgomery captured Montreal without bloodshed, but his assault on Quebec City during a blizzard on New Year's Eve was a disaster. Why did the Canadians not join the revolution? Several reasons. The Quebec Act had safeguarded their religious rights and civil laws. The invasion failed, and Quebec remained loyal. But the war's end in 1783 transformed Canada nonetheless. As the United States secured independence, tens of thousands of loyalists, those who had sided with the Crown, fled north into British territory. They settled in Nova Scotia, Quebec, and newly carved lands west of Montreal. The influx of English-speaking loyalists strained the colonial structure of Quebec, where French civil law and Catholic institutions still prevailed. Their solution was legislative division. In 1791, the Constitutional Act split Quebec into two colonies: Upper Canada, English-speaking Protestant, and governed under English common law; Lower Canada, French-speaking, Catholic, and governed under French civil law. Each had its own legislature and lieutenant governor. Canada was no longer a singular colony. It was becoming a plural society, forged by revolution and migration, one step closer to the Federation it would one day become. As the 19th century dawned, tensions simmered once again along the Canada-US border. The fledgling United States, now confident in its independence, looked northward with ambition and suspicion. Britain's continued presence in North America was viewed as a colonial threat. Their leaders believed conquest of Canada would be swift and easy, mere matter of marching, as one congressman arrogantly put it. Canada, caught in the middle, would soon become a battlefield once more. Though outnumbered, they knew the terrain and had more at stake. This was their land. The seeds of the War of 1812 were sown in global conflict. Britain, locked in a titanic struggle with Napoleon's France, imposed naval blockades that hindered American trade. York was captured and burned by American forces in 1813, only for British and Canadian troops to retaliate by burning Washington, D.C. in 1814. The alliance between indigenous nations and the British, however, did not fare as well. Tecumseh was killed in battle, and his vision of a united indigenous homeland died with him. In the decades after 1815, Canada's colonial governments remained rigidly hierarchical. Power rested in the hands of British-appointed governors and privileged elites, the family compact in Upper Canada, and the Chateau clique in Lower Canada. The elected assemblies, though present, held little real authority. Britain would abandon its promises to its indigenous allies in the post-war settlement. Towns were razed, forts changed hands, civilians endured terror and chaos. His Durham Report, published in 1839, was blunt. He also proposed the union of Upper and Lower Canada into a single colony, believing it would help assimilate French Canadians and neutralize cultural divisions. He attributed the rebellions to a clash of races, English versus French, but also called for sweeping reforms. Canada East. They shared a legislature, but real power still rested with the governor and appointed councils. The U.S., in turn, accused Britain of impressing American sailors into the Royal Navy and arming indigenous nations along its western frontier. On June 18, 1812, the United States declared war on Britain. Reformers such as William Lyon Mackenzie, a fiery newspaper editor, demanded transparency, local control, and an end to corruption. They sought not just political reform, but recognition of their language, culture, and civil rights. Their 92 resolutions, submitted in 1834, laid out a comprehensive vision for responsible government, but were dismissed by London. Papineau supporters rose in armed resistance around Montreal and the Richelieu Valley. Though both rebellions were swiftly crushed by British forces, their causes resonated. They were wrong. Canada's defenders, British regulars, Canadian militias, Indigenous warriors, and loyalist settlers rose with surprising resolve. One of the war's first heroes emerged in the person of Major General Isaac Brock, who led a daring campaign to seize Detroit alongside Shawnee leader Tecumseh, a brilliant strategist, who dreamed of a pan-Indigenous confederacy. Their partnership stunned American forces and demonstrated the essential role of Indigenous alliances in Canada's defense. Battles raged along the Great Lakes and Niagara frontier. Women, too, became symbols of Canadian resistance. The Treaty of Ghent, signed in December 1814, ended the war without territorial change, but it changed Canada profoundly. Laura Secord, a loyalist housewife, walked 32 kilometers through dense forest to warn British forces of an impending American attack. Her warning led to a key victory at the Battle of Beaver Dams by 1814. With Napoleon defeated in Europe, Britain turned greater attention to North America. Peace negotiations began. The war cemented a sense of Canadian identity, loyal to the Crown, distinct from the United States, and defined by endurance. Yet out of the ashes of the War of 1812, Canada emerged stronger, more united, and more self-aware. The war had ended, but peace did not bring contentment. This disconnect between the people and their rulers festered into frustration, and eventually revolt. In Upper Canada, English-speaking settlers, many of them loyalists or recent immigrants from Britain, grew discontent with land monopolies and government patronage. In Lower Canada, tensions were deeper still. The French-speaking majority, led by Louis-Joseph Papineau and the Parti Patriot, felt increasingly marginalized. Frustration turned to fire. In 1837, uprisings broke out in both colonies. Mackenzie led a ragtag group of rebels toward Toronto. The violence shocked the British public. In response, London sent Lord Durham, a reform-minded aristocrat, to investigate. Durham's central recommendation: responsible government. That is, colonial governments accountable not to appointed governors, but to elected assemblies. In 1841, the Act of Union created the Province of Canada merger of the two colonies into Canada West, though Durham's proposed solutions were flawed particularly. His hope of anglicizing French Canadians, his report laid the groundwork for democratic reform. The seeds of self-government had been planted. Canada was learning how to govern itself, not yet a nation, but no longer just a colony. By the mid-19th century, the province of Canada was a complicated experiment to cultures, one government, and growing dissatisfaction on all sides. The Act of Union had forced Canada West and Canada East into a single political entity. Each granted equal representation in the legislature. But this equality masked real imbalance. English politicians demanded representation by population, a reform that would give them more influence. French Canadians, fearing assimilation and marginalization, resisted fiercely. Political deadlock became chronic. Canada West's population soon outgrew Canada East's, yet still held the same number of seats. Yet even as paralysis reigned in the East, new provinces were taking shape in the West. Railways were laid, shipyards flourished, trade boomed with Britain and the United States. But each colony faced its own limitations: small populations, economic vulnerability, and dependence on imperial support. Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island developed their own political cultures and economic strengths. It was in this climate that the idea of unification began to spread, not as an act of idealism, but of necessity. And Charles Tupper of Nova Scotia began to imagine something new, a federation, instead. They proposed a bold new plan: to unite all the British North American colonies under one central government, Canada. London's new policy: promote colonial unity and fiscal responsibility. Three powerful forces accelerated the move toward Confederation. First, the collapse of the Reciprocity Agreement with the United States in 1866 left British North American colonies economically vulnerable. They needed stronger internal markets. Second, Britain, weary of defending distant colonies, subtly encouraged self-reliance. It envisioned a federal system, a strong central government handling national affairs, with provinces retaining control over local matters like education and civil law. Third, there was the American threat. The U.S. Civil War had shaken the continent. On July 1, 1867, the British North America Act came into force, creating the Dominion of Canada. English reformers like Brown welcomed it as a path to end political gridlock. For Macdonald, it was the blueprint of a strong, united nation under a centralized authority. Many Canadians feared U.S. expansionism, especially after violent cross-border raids by Irish-American groups known as the Fenians. In this environment, visionaries emerged. Leaders like John A. Macdonald of Canada West, Georgette N. Cartier of Canada East, George Brown of the Reformers in 1864. These men met at the Charlottetown Conference, originally meant to discuss maritime union. The foundations were being laid. It would take years to shape. The idea had taken hold. In the West, the vast Rupert's Land, still under control of the Hudson's Bay Company, remained outside Confederation, as did British Columbia and Prince Edward Island. A new country was stirring in the womb of empire. The vision of a united Canada moved swiftly from concept to reality, driven by ambition, compromise, and geopolitical urgency. The Red River Resistance of 1869–70 was both a political and cultural stand. But for now, a new Western province was born. Riel negotiated Manitoba's entry into Confederation with protections for language, religion, and land. At the Quebec Conference of 1864, delegates from Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick drafted the 72 resolutions, a framework for Confederation. A nation had been born not in revolution, but negotiation. In 1873, Prince Edward Island entered, enticed by debt relief and rail commitments. French Canadians under Cartier's leadership saw federalism as a shield to protect their language and culture. The plan traveled to London, where it received final approval. At first, Confederation united 4 provinces. The Red River Settlement, home to thousands of people of mixed Indigenous and European ancestry, was not consulted. Their land rights and cultural protections were ignored. Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. The capital would be Ottawa. a compromise site chosen for its location on the Ontario-Quebec border and defensibility. Sir John A. Macdonald became Canada's first Prime Minister. Still, it was a fragile beginning. Nova Scotia resisted, with many angry over being swept into union without a popular vote. In Quebec, critics feared English dominance. But the momentum continued. In 1869, Canada purchased Rupert's Land, yet annexation brought crisis. Under Louis Riel, they formed a provisional government. Manitoba joined Canada in 1870, the postage stamp province. Riel, initially seen as a hero, would later be vilified. In 1871, British Columbia joined, lured by promises of a transcontinental railway. From sea to sea, a young Canada was growing. But with each step, new tensions arose between peoples, between promises and delivery, between national unity and regional identity. The work of building Canada had only just begun. As the ink dried on the Confederation documents, the dream of a coast-to-coast Canada became more than rhetoric. It was a promise, one that needed to be fulfilled by steel, settlement, and sacrifice. At the heart of that promise was the Canadian Pacific Railway. British Columbia had joined Confederation in 1871 on the condition that a transcontinental railway would be built to link it to the east. The United States, still fresh from its Manifest Destiny fervor, eyed the Canadian West hungrily. Settlement, infrastructure, and defense were paramount. But laying track through thousands of kilometers of mountains, swamps, and prairies was a Herculean task, financially, politically, and physically. The vastness of Canada's geography was both its strength and its challenge. Thousands of workers, including over 15,000 Chinese laborers, were brought in to blast tunnels through the Rockies and lay track across treacherous terrain. These workers toiled under brutal conditions for paltry wages, and many paid with their lives. In exchange for land, these treaties promised reserves, education, healthcare, and tools. But the promises were frequently broken or delayed. Sir John A. Macdonald, now presiding over a country of 7 provinces, knew the railway was essential not just for commerce, but for sovereignty. Riel returned from exile to lead them. Indigenous leaders like Poundmaker and Big Bear joined the calls for justice peacefully, but resolutely. Though many in Quebec viewed him as a defender of minority rights, the English-speaking majority demanded punishment. In 1873, scandal erupted. The Pacific Scandal, a revelation that Macdonald's conservative government had accepted bribes from railway financiers, forced his resignation. But the dream endured. By 1881, with Macdonald back in power, construction resumed at full steam. But Riel's execution deepened national divisions between English and French, East and West, settler and Indigenous. As rails stretched westward, so too did Ottawa's reach, to clear the way for settlement. The government negotiated a series of treaties known as the Numbered Treaties with Indigenous nations. Meanwhile, whose leader Louis Riel had secured Manitoba's entry into Confederation in 1870, found their rights once again under threat. This would shelter Canadian industries and promote domestic manufacturing, particularly in Ontario and Quebec. By 1885, disillusioned with broken land promises and the erosion of their culture, the Saskatchewan River Valley rose again. They brought new traditions, foods, and languages. Gradually reshaping the demographic mosaic of the West, the government responded with force. The Northwest Rebellion was short-lived. Riel was captured and put on trial. Most devastating of all was the rise of the residential school system designed to kill the Indian and the child. Run by churches and funded by the government, these schools tore children from their families, eroding identity, language, and tradition. Canadian painters, like the precursors to the Group of Seven, captured the wild majesty of the northern landscape. The election of Wilfrid Laurier in 1896, the first French-Canadian Prime Minister, symbolized a moment of optimism and unity. Laurier, eloquent and charismatic, promised a vision of sunny ways, a Canada of compromise, growth, and bilingual cooperation. Canadian poets and authors wrote of snow, struggle, and the complexity of colonial life. Macdonald envisioned the prairies as Canada's breadbasket, and the settlement of the West as a buffer against American encroachment. Riel was hanged for treason in November 1885, The Transcontinental Railway was completed just months earlier. Confined to reserves, denied their traditional ways of life, and subjected to starvation as the bison herds vanished. Many communities suffered under an increasingly aggressive policy of assimilation. Canada had bound itself by rail, but beneath the surface, its fractures widened. With the railway complete and the rebellion crushed, Canada entered a period of consolidation, a time when the government sought to bind its far-flung regions into a single national economy, culture, and political identity. At the heart of this effort was Macdonald's national policy, a triad of strategies designed to fortify Canada's economy and secure its sovereignty. First, high protective tariffs were imposed on imported goods, especially those from the United States. Second, the Transcontinental Railway would serve as the arteries of trade and mobility, moving people and goods efficiently across provinces. Third, and perhaps most consequentially, was the policy of immigration and Western settlement. Immigrants from Europe, especially Eastern Europeans, Scandinavians, Germans, and Ukrainians were encouraged to settle in the fertile lands of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Yet this period of expansion was also marked by oppression. For Indigenous peoples, the 1880s and 1890s brought deepening hardship. The Indian Act of 1876 had laid the groundwork, and it was enforced with even greater rigidity now. Indigenous governance systems were dismantled, cultural ceremonies were criminalized. Yet while some Canadians were being forcibly silenced, others were raising new voices. In the cities of Ontario and Quebec, the first stirrings of a Canadian cultural identity began to take shape, distinct from both Britain and the United States. Politically, the country matured. Though still tethered to Britain, Canada was growing in confidence. Under Laurier, Canada entered the 20th century poised for greatness, but also carrying the burdens of injustice and inequality. The frontier was closing. The nation was growing. The 20th century would test its character. As the 20th century opened, Canada stood at the edge of transformation. It was no longer merely a British outpost. The booming economy, surging immigration, and growing urban centers. Canada had become a dominion with its own ambitions. The great powers, entangled in alliances and rivalries, marched toward war. When the First World War erupted in 1914, Canada, as part of the British Empire, was swept into the conflict. English Canadians rallied to support Britain. But beneath the unity, divisions brewed. Yet even as Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier predicted a golden century, storm clouds gathered in Europe. At first, there was enthusiasm. Patriotic fervor swept through the country. Young men enlisted in droves. On the Western Front, Canadian troops earned a reputation for resilience and effectiveness. They fought at Ypres, where they faced chlorine gas for the first time, supported the war effort through organizations like the Red Cross. The contribution of women began to shift public opinion. In 1917, women gained the federal vote first. Those with relatives in service, then extended more broadly. English Canada supported it. French Canada, particularly in Quebec, opposed it bitterly. Riots broke out. The conscription crisis of 1917 exposed a deep fracture in Canadian unity. They stormed Vimy Ridge in 1917, a meticulously planned victory that became a symbol of national pride and sacrifice. At Passchendaele, they endured a nightmare of mud and shell fire. These were symbolic milestones, proof that Canada was no longer just a colony, but a nation with a voice on the world stage. French Canadians, many of whom felt little connection to Britain's war, were reluctant to enlist. One of the most defining domestic events came in 1919, just before the decade opened. The Winnipeg General Strike. Over 30,000 workers walked off the job. The city shut down. Business leaders panicked. Federal government sent in troops. The bloody Saturday confrontation on June 21st left one man dead and many injured. Though the strike was broken, it sparked a new labor consciousness in Canada. Laurier, now in opposition, tried to maintain balance. But his successor, Robert Borden, took a more aggressive stance. Only in 1929, with the Persons Case, would Canadian women be legally recognized as persons under British law, eligible to sit in the Senate. The residential school system expanded. Potlatches and other cultural ceremonies were banned. Indigenous voices were silenced in Parliament and courts. This victory, led by the famous five, Millie Murphy, Nellie McClung, Irene Parlby, Louise McKinney, and Henrietta Muir Edwards, marked a landmark in Canadian feminism. Canada's involvement in the war was immense. Over 620,000 Canadians enlisted. Unemployment soared over 25% in some cities. Families lost homes. Farmers lost land. The war had tested Canada, and now the challenge was to recover and define the peace. Protests rose. In 1935, the Onto-Ottawa Trek saw hundreds of jobless workers ride trains east to demand reform. They were stopped in Regina, and the confrontation turned violent. But the war came at a horrific cost. Over 60,000 Canadians died, and more than 170,000 were wounded. When finally allowed, many were relegated to labor battalions. Jazz bands played in Montreal. Hockey, rapidly becoming a national obsession, found professional form in the founding of the NHL in 1917. He introduced a New Deal, inspired by U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, but too late. In 1935, William Lyon Mackenzie King returned to power. Indigenous soldiers, despite facing racism at home, served with distinction on the front lines. Radios, cars, and department stores became symbols of modern life. The Roaring Twenties reached Canadian shores. At home, the war transformed society. Women entered factories, ran farms, but not all experienced the war equally. Black Canadians, eager to serve, were initially barred from enlisting. As casualties mounted, Borden faced pressure to maintain troop levels. In 1917, he introduced conscription mandatory military service. This move split the country, yet Canada emerged from the war changed. In 1919, Canada signed the Treaty of Versailles separately from Britain, and gained a seat at the League of Nations. But victory came with scars, visible and invisible. The war had forged a sense of Canadian identity, but also left a legacy of grief, debt, and division. The 1920s began with the echo of cannons fading, and the return of soldiers to farms, towns, and cities forever changed. Economically, the early 1920s were rocky. Inflation, labor, unrest, and reintegration of veterans strained the system. What began as a dispute over wages and working conditions became one of the largest and most dramatic labor actions in Canadian history. As the 1920s progressed, prosperity returned. Canada experienced a surge in industrial output, urbanization, and consumerism. Cultural life blossomed. Writers like Mazo de la Roche, in the early group of 7 painters, Lerona, Harris, A.Y. Jackson, and others gave Canada a distinctive artistic voice, yet inequalities remained. Women, though granted the federal vote by 1918, were still excluded from many professions. For Indigenous peoples, however, the 1920s were years of intensifying assimilation. Then, in 1929, the dream unraveled. The stock market crash sent shockwaves across the globe. In Canada, the Great Depression hit hard. Wheat prices collapsed. Exports plummeted. Relief camps were set up for unemployed men, offering meager wages for grueling labor. Elected in 1930, struggled to respond. By the end of the decade, Canada was wary but beginning to recover. Canada would have no choice but to respond. On September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. Canada, though, still a dominion within the British Empire, waited 1 week before declaring war on September 10. It was a deliberate decision by Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King. Memories of the Great War's horrors were still fresh. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, filling roles in factories, offices, and military services. The term Rosie the Riveter took on a distinctly Canadian face. But Canadians answered the call. Over 1.1 million men and women would serve in uniform out of a population of just over 11 million, asserting Canada's autonomy on the world stage. In Dieppe in 1942, a mostly Canadian assault ended in disaster, over 900 killed in one day. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, they stormed Juno Beach, playing a crucial role in the Allied invasion of Normandy. Through the winter of 1944-45, they helped liberate the Netherlands from Nazi occupation, earning lifelong gratitude. Yet lessons learned there paved the way for success in later amphibious operations. This time, the war was not greeted with cheers. At home, Canada became an industrial powerhouse. Shipyards, munitions factories, and aircraft plants roared to life. Socially, the war cracked old barriers. Women, immigrants, and minorities demanded new roles and recognition. The horrors of the Holocaust, the use of atomic bombs, and the revelation of genocide forever changed global consciousness and Canadian politics too. Politically, Canada emerged as a middle power, respected for its military, diplomacy, and production capacity. Overseas, Canadian forces earned distinction. It was the birth of modern Canada. In Hong Kong, they suffered devastating losses in 1941. Fighting a hopeless defense against Japanese invaders, factories that had produced tanks now produced cars and appliances. Displaced persons from war-torn Europe, Holocaust survivors, and refugees found a new start in Canada. Unlike earlier waves of immigration, these newcomers came from diverse cultural and religious backgrounds, including Italians, Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews. They reshaped Canada's cities and labor force. Unemployment insurance, family allowances, and veterans' benefits helped raise the standard of living. That same year, Canadian diplomat Lester B. Pearson helped shape the United Nations, establishing Canada's role in peacekeeping and international cooperation. By the 1950s, Canada was one of the wealthiest nations in the world. Families grew in what became known as the baby boom. Hockey night in Canada was more than sport. Tit was ritual. Canadian literature too began to find its voice with writers like Gabrielle Roy and Hugh MacLennan. In Italy, Canadians helped liberate towns and scale mountain passes. He championed civil rights and was the first to include Indigenous people in the federal vote in 1960. Canada's relationship with the United States grew more complex, especially over military cooperation and nuclear weapons. The Avro Arrow, a cutting-edge Canadian jet fighter, was controversially scrapped in 1959, a decision still debated as a lost moment of Canadian innovation. At war's end, over 45,000 Canadians had died. Tens of thousands more were wounded. The war transformed Canada. Economically, the Depression was over. Canada's GDP had doubled. Indigenous peoples remained excluded from full citizenship and were subject to oppressive laws, including bans on hiring lawyers to contest land rights. The residential school system continued to inflict intergenerational trauma. Their properties were confiscated. Decades later, the Canadian government would apologize, but the trauma endured. Yet not all stories were of glory. Japanese Canadians, over 22,000 of them, were forcibly removed from their homes in British Columbia, labeled enemy aliens, and placed in internment camps. Indigenous veterans returned home to find they had fought for a country that still denied them basic rights. Still, the war sparked change. In 1945, Canada was a founding member of the United Nations. It had shed the last vestiges of colonial dependency and emerged with a distinct voice. The Second World War was a crucible. In its fires, a new Canada was forged, modern, assertive, and ready to help build a better world. The war was over, but Canada was not the same country that had entered it. In the late 1940s and 1950s, Canada entered a period of remarkable transformation, a time of economic growth, immigration, and national introspection. Economic prosperity surged. Soldiers returned home to booming industries, suburban housing developments, and rising wages. The federal government introduced sweeping social programs. Immigration surged too, yet the immigration system still bore the stains of racism. Chinese and South Asian immigration remained severely restricted until the late 1940s. Still, winds of change were blowing. In 1947, Canada introduced its first Canadian Citizenship Act, allowing Canadians to be citizens of Canada, not just British subjects. Culturally, Canada sought to distinguish itself. Canadian broadcasting and media expanded as the CBC, launched in the 1930s, became a unifying voice across provinces and languages. In 1957, John Diefenbacher, a charismatic populist from Saskatchewan, became Prime Minister. But his tenure was also marked by tension. The Cold War loomed. Still, by 1960, Canada stood tall, a prosperous middle power. a democratic and increasingly multicultural society. Yet beneath the surface, the question of identity remained. Was Canada British, American, French? Something else entirely. The 1960s would force the country to confront its foundations and redefine itself for a new generation. As the 1960s dawned, Canada entered one of the most transformative decades in its history, socially, politically, and culturally. A decade of voices rising, institutions evolving, and identity reimagined. Nowhere was this change more profound than in Quebec. The quiet revolution La Tranquille was not marked by violence or rebellion, but by rapid and sweeping reform. When the provincial government of Quebec passed from the long-dominant conservative Union Nationale to the Liberal Party under Jean Lesage in 1960, everything changed. Slogans like Matters chez nous, Masters in our own house, captured the spirit of a generation no longer content to be second-class citizens in their own province. For decades, Quebec's French-speaking majority had lived under a system dominated by the Catholic Church, conservative elites, and economic dependence on English-speaking business interests. But the Quiet Revolution sought to reclaim control over Quebec's destiny. The new provincial government secularized education, expanded the welfare state, created Hydro as a nationalized symbol of pride, and promoted French language rights. For some, this was a long overdue assertion of independence. For others, it felt like abandoning history, yet the new flag quickly became a beloved national symbol. In the rest of Canada, these changes sent shockwaves. Some pushed beyond reform, toward sovereignty. The Parti Québécois, formed in 1968, sought full independence for Quebec through democratic means. Students challenged the status quo. Immigrants redefined what it meant to be Canadian. Meanwhile, radical elements like the FLQ used violence to push the cause. English Canada began to grapple with the question, what kind of country is Canada? Was it bilingual and bicultural? Or was it something more complex? National identity debates intensified. In 1965, Canada made a bold symbolic shift. It adopted the maple leaf flag, replacing the British red ensign. He promised a modern, just, united Canada built, not on conformity, but on pluralism and equality. In 1967, Canada celebrated its centennial with Expo 67 in Montreal, dazzling World's fair that projected Canada as a modern, diverse, optimistic country. But in October, they kidnapped British Trade Commissioner James Cross. And days later, Pierre Laporte, a Quebec cabinet minister, dignitaries from around the world walked its pavilions. Montreal shone. Canadians felt, perhaps for the first time, truly at home on the world stage. It was a bold move to ease tensions between Quebec and the rest of Canada, one that elevated French within federal services and diplomacy. But beneath the pride, divisions festered. Others feared the heavy-handedness. The crisis deepened the gulf between federalists and separatists. But within a year of his leadership, the unity he sought was tested in dramatic fashion. Soldiers patrolled the streets of Montreal. He positioned Canada as a progressive nation with strong civil rights. Rather than assimilating immigrants, Canada would embrace cultural diversity as a strength. It was a message to both newcomers and Quebec. You belong in your own language, faith, and identity. Oil crises, inflation, and rising unemployment tested Trudeau's popularity. In Quebec, the call for autonomy grew louder. Across Canada, other voices rose. The Indigenous rights movement began organizing. Women demanded equality, and at the center of it all rose a new political force. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, a brilliant, flamboyant Montreal intellectual who would soon take center stage and redefine Canada's vision of itself. With charisma, intellect, and style, rarely seen in Canadian politics, Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister in 1968, sweeping into office on a wave of optimism known as Trudeau-mania. It was a seismic moment. For the first time, Quebec's government was openly earnest. His central vision was a bilingual and multicultural Canada. In 1969, Trudeau's government passed the Official Languages Act, making French and English equal in federal institutions. Trudeau championed a strong federal government, national unity, and civil liberties. In October 1970, Quebec was rocked by a political crisis that shook the nation. The October Crisis, the FLQ, a radical separatist group, had been escalating for years, setting off bombs, robbing banks, and calling for revolution. The country was stunned. In response, Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act, the first and only time in peacetime Canadian history. Civil liberties were suspended. Thousands were arrested without charge. When asked how far he would go to preserve order, Trudeau famously replied, "Just watch me." Laporte was later found murdered. Cross was released. The FLQ was dismantled. The memory lingered. Many praised Trudeau for protecting democracy. Meanwhile, Canada was changing in other ways. In 1971, Trudeau's government formally adopted multiculturalism as official policy, a global first. Trudeau also expanded social programs, universal health care, Canada Pension Plan, and legal reforms that decriminalized homosexuality and contraception. But by the late 1970s, economic challenges returned. And in Quebec, nationalism remained potent. In 1976, the Parti Québécois, led by the provincial election, the stage was set for a defining confrontation in Canadian history. The 1980 Quebec referendum, Trudeau's vision of unity, would face its greatest test. In 1980, the unity of Canada faced a historic challenge. The Parti Québécois, led by had formed the provincial government of Quebec and promised to hold a referendum on sovereignty association, a proposal for Quebec to become politically independent while maintaining economic ties with the rest of Canada. On May 20th, 1980, the question was put to the people of Quebec: should the province negotiate sovereignty? It was not a fringe movement. It was a democratic, grassroots surge backed by deep emotion, culture, and history. For many French Quebecers, it was a chance to take control of their destiny after centuries of perceived marginalization. But the Federalist camp fought back with equal vigor. Pierre Trudeau, himself a Quebecer, returned to his roots as a brilliant orator. In impassioned speeches, he promised constitutional reform if Quebec rejected independence, real change within a united Canada. The people answered. 60% voted no, Quebec would stay. But the question of its place in Canada remained unresolved. Trudeau now turned to his next goal: to patriate the Constitution, bring it home from Britain, and craft a Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms that would guarantee individual liberties in law. Only Quebec refused to sign. Trudeau proceeded regardless, believing national unity required a stronger, more equitable framework. The Constitution Act, 1982, enshrined the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, a foundational document guaranteeing freedom of speech, religion, mobility, and equality. The process, however, was divisive. In 1981, after intense negotiations, an agreement was reached between the federal government and 9 provinces. On April 17, 1982, Queen Elizabeth II signed the Canada Act. Formally ending Britain's role in Canadian constitutional affairs, it was a crowning achievement. But the absence of Quebec's signature left a scar. But it required unanimous provincial consent. Free Trade Agreement in 1988, and later the North American Free Trade Agreement with Mexico in 1992, deepening Canada's economic integration with the continent. As the 1980s progressed, the country searched for reconciliation. Western Canada, feeling neglected, fueled Reform Party growth. The economy struggled as voters grew weary. In 1987, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, Quebec-born progressive conservative, brokered the Meech Lake Accord, a constitutional amendment to recognize Quebec as a distinct society. By 1990, 2 provinces, Manitoba and Newfoundland, refused to ratify it. The accord died. So did hopes of quick constitutional harmony. Another attempt, the Charlottetown Accord in 1992, included Indigenous self-government and broader reforms. It was put to a national referendum. It failed. From a majority government, they were reduced to just 2 seats. The country's political landscape fragmented. The dream of constitutional unity crumbled again. Yet during this time, other transformative changes took place. Mulroney's government negotiated the Canada. Still, the 1980s and early 90s ended on an uncertain note. Quebec was disillusioned. In 1993, Canadians elected a new government, a new political era began. He argued that Quebec deserved full independence to protect its culture, language, and values. And the Federalists countered with economic warnings and promises of renewed federalism. The 1990s began with a wave of political realignment and deep questions about Canadian identity and cohesion. In 1993, the Progressive Conservatives, after nearly a decade under Brian Mulroney, collapsed spectacularly. Two regional parties surged. It was controversial but signaled federal resolve. The Bloc Québécois, led by Lucien Bouchard, represented Quebec's separatist interests in the federal parliament. Troops served in Bosnia, Somalia, and Rwanda, though not without controversy. The revelations of misconduct during the Somalia mission led to military reforms and public inquiry. Through deep cuts and restructuring, it eliminated the federal deficit by the late 1990s, gaining praise from global institutions. The economy boomed. Unemployment fell. The Reform Party, based in the West, voiced frustration over central Canadian dominance and called for democratic reform. Toronto became one of the most diverse cities in the world. Cities like Vancouver, Calgary, and Ottawa reflected a changing, globalized identity. Jean, leader of the Liberal Party, swept into power as Prime Minister, promising economic recovery, unity, and pragmatic governance. But national unity would again take center stage. In 1995, Quebec called its second referendum on sovereignty. This time, the stakes were higher. The question was clearer, the passion more intense. Lucien Bouchard, charismatic and articulate, led the yes side. The vote came down to the wire. On October 30th, 1995, Quebecers voted 50.6% no to 49.4% yes. A margin of less than 55,000 votes kept Canada together. The country exhaled, but the close result shook Ottawa to its core. In response, government passed the Clarity Act in 2000, affirming that any future referendum on secession would require a clear question and a clear majority. Meanwhile, the government tackled Canada's fiscal deficit. On the world stage, Canada embraced peacekeeping and diplomacy. Culturally, Canada embraced its diversity. Multiculturalism flourished. Immigration from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East surged. Domestically, Indigenous activism gained momentum. In 1990, the OKA crisis, 78-day standoff between Mohawk protesters and police over land rights, shocked the nation and highlighted historical injustices. By the end of the decade, Canada was stable, prosperous, and internationally respected. But beneath the surface, new challenges brewed: reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, redefining Canada's place in a post-Cold War world, and preparing for a new century. As the 21st century dawned, Canada stood at a crossroads, economically strong, politically stable, and culturally confident. Yet the challenges ahead would test the nation's values, resilience, and global identity. The budget was balanced, debt was reduced, and the economy grew steadily. The Liberals, still led by Jean, won a third majority in 2000. Under his leadership, Canada remained committed to fiscal responsibility and social programs. But events far beyond Canada's borders would soon shift the national focus. And in Afghanistan, Canada would join the U.S.-led coalition to combat terrorism. On September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks in the United States sent shockwaves across the world. Canada responded with solidarity. Planes were grounded, borders tightened. Canadian troops arrived in Kandahar in 2002. The government passed new anti-terror legislation, raising debates over civil liberties and surveillance. Harper's Conservatives appealed to both Western interests and middle-class voters nationwide. Over the next decade, over 40,000 Canadian soldiers served in Afghanistan, the country's largest military. Deployment since the Second World War, 158 Canadians died in the conflict. Harper, a pragmatic and disciplined leader from Alberta, ushered in a new political era. Canadian artists, musicians, and filmmakers Arcade, Fire, Sarah Polley, Michael and Datia found international audiences. Many more were wounded, physically and emotionally. At home, security measures intensified. Canada weathered the storm better than most, thanks to a tightly regulated banking system. But jobs were lost, growth slowed. and Arlene Ling San stepped down. In a triumph of sport and national pride, Team Canada won the most gold medals ever awarded at a single Winter Olympics. The nation roared as Sidney Crosby scored the golden goal in hockey. Speaking in the House of Commons, Harper acknowledged the deep damage inflicted on generations of Indigenous children and communities. It was a pivotal moment in national reconciliation. His successor, Paul Martin, struggled to maintain liberal unity amid the fallout from the sponsorship corruption scandal involving the misuse of federal funds in Quebec. His tenure was marked by discipline and incrementalism, but also growing criticism. In 2006, the Conservative Party, now united under Stephen Harper, came to power. His government focused on tax cuts, land order legislation, military spending, and Arctic sovereignty. One of his key achievements was the 2008 formal apology for the residential school system, because it's 2015, he quipped, when asked why half his ministers were women. Meanwhile, Canada's global image evolved. His campaign promised sunny ways, gender equality, climate action, Indigenous reconciliation, and global re-engagement. The TRC issued 94 calls to action. Cuts to science funding and census data collection sparked backlash among academics and policymakers. While Harper positioned Canada as a resource-driven economy, others worried about long-term sustainability. The final report in 2019 described Canada's treatment of Indigenous women as a form of genocide, a conclusion that ignited debate and demand for accountability. The country remained a model of multiculturalism. Cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Calgary became global hubs for finance, tech, and the arts. Yet Canada was not immune to global turmoil. Yet it also purchased the Trans Mountain Pipeline, drawing ire from environmentalists and Indigenous land defenders. The Conservative Party under Andrew Scheer won the popular vote but failed to secure enough seats. The Bloc Québécois resurged in Quebec. The NDP, led by Jagmeet Singh, became kingmakers. And the Green Party gained its highest ever vote share. In 2008, the world plunged into a financial crisis. Housing markets collapsed, stock markets tumbled. Still, Canadians remained cautiously optimistic. By 2010, Canada had hosted its third Olympic Games, Vancouver 2010. It was more than a sporting victory. It was a moment of unity. A country often modest in tone stood tall and cheered. As the second decade of the 21st century unfolded, Canada found itself pulled between competing forces, tradition and transformation, reconciliation and reckoning, prosperity and inequality. Stephen Harper continued to lead a stable conservative government until 2015. Environmental groups, scientists, and Indigenous communities protested the government's climate policies and support for oil sands development. Internationally, Canada's influence seemed to wane. Once known as a global peacekeeping leader, its role in diplomacy appeared diminished. Then, in 2015, came a dramatic shift. Justin Trudeau, son of Pierre Trudeau, led the Liberal Party to a sweeping majority with a message of hope, inclusivity, and generational change. Trudeau's cabinet was historic, gender-balanced, ethnically diverse, and symbolically powerful. Yet promises met complex realities. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, completed in 2015, laid bare the devastating legacy of residential schools, documenting stories of abuse, cultural loss, and intergenerational trauma. Some were implemented. Many were not. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry, launched by Trudeau's government, found systemic violence and indifference. Climate policy, too, was contested. Canada implemented carbon pricing, supported renewable energy, and signed the Paris Climate Agreement. Political polarization deepened. The 2019 election reduced Trudeau's Liberals to a minority government. Social movements surged. #MeToo, Black Lives Matter, Indigenous land protectors. And student climate strikes gave voice to a new generation. By the end of the decade, Canada stood at a delicate crossroads, more diverse, more connected, more aware, but also more divided and more determined. The 2020s began not with celebration, but with crisis. In early 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the globe, bringing modern life to a sudden, jarring halt. For Canadians, it was a moment of profound uncertainty and shared vulnerability. The federal government, under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, responded with sweeping emergency measures, wage subsidies, emergency response benefits, eviction protections, and small business support. Hospitals filled, borders closed, streets emptied. Millions of Canadians were forced into lockdowns, remote work, and isolation. Science led the way. Canadian researchers joined global vaccine efforts. By 2021, mass vaccination campaigns were underway. Public health workers, doctors, nurses, and essential employees became national heroes. Yet the pandemic also revealed deep inequalities. Racialized communities and frontline workers bore the brunt of the virus. Long-term care homes suffered devastating outbreaks. Mental health crises escalated. Misinformation spread. Trust in institutions was tested. But even amidst crisis, the country adapted. Parliament shifted online. Communities rallied to help one another. Canada, though shaken, endured and learned. As the pandemic waned, a second national reckoning erupted. In 2021, the remains of 215 children were discovered in unmarked graves at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. More graves followed, hundreds, then thousands. The reality of the residential school system, long known to Indigenous communities, became undeniable to all Canadians. Survivors wept. Canada was forced to confront the buried truth of its past. Flags flew at half-mast. Church leaders apologized. The Conservatives, led by Aaron O'Toole, and the NDP, led by Jagmeet Singh, each gained influence. In 2022, the Freedom Convoy, a protest by truckers and anti-mandate activists, occupied Ottawa for weeks. The government invoked the Emergencies Act for the first time ever. The response divided public opinion and sparked legal and ethical debate. The People's Party of Canada, a far-right populist group, emerged as a vocal minority force. Calls for justice, land back, and reparations intensified. Ceremonies, protests, and educational movements swept across the country. Her son became King Charles III, prompting renewed debate about Canada's future constitutional structure and Indigenous ground relations. The orange shirt became a symbol of remembrance, and September 30th was declared National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Meanwhile, the climate crisis grew urgent. Cultural expression flourished in film, music, literature, and digital media. Canadian creators shaped global conversations while honoring local roots. Wildfires raged in British Columbia. Domes shattered records. Floods washed away towns. Droughts withered crops. In response, Canada committed to net zero emissions by 2050, increased carbon pricing, and invested in green infrastructure, but tensions over energy policy remained, especially in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Politics shifted once again. Out of fur trades and fractured alliances grew empires, wars, and settlements. The railway bound a nation together. It also displaced nations that had lived here for generations. They resisted, and Louis Riel paid with his life. New France rose and fell. British North America expanded, and from fragile treaties came the province of Canada. At Vimy Ridge and Juno Beach, a country forged its pride in blood and sacrifice, missing and murdered Indigenous women. Systemic injustice. Reconciliation remains not a finish line, but an obligation. Twice it stood on the edge of independence, twice it stayed. But its voice forever changed the Federation. It built social safety nets, opened its doors to immigrants, and embraced pluralism as policy, not just in law, but as identity. The vast tundra, the boreal forest, the Rockies, and the prairies. The oceans and lakes still hold stories, still shape the people. Yet even then, inequalities endured against women, against people of color, against Indigenous peoples. Out of rebellion and compromise came the seeds of democracy, of treaties and cities, or families who have lived here for millennia and others who arrived last week. It is the story of a land shaped over millennia by ice and fire, by trade and treaties, by war, migration, and reconciliation. Trudeau called a snap election in 2021, hoping for a majority. He got another minority. It has also shown resilience, compassion, and resolve. It has become a country of diversity, not just in appearance, but in principle. Divides deepened over public health, freedom, and federalism. Yet amidst turmoil, Canada's democratic institutions held firm. The monarchy shifted too. In 2022, Queen Elizabeth II, Canada's head of state for 70 years, passed away. As the decade progressed, the conversation evolved. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Nation, the Cree, the Micmac, the Dene, the Inuit, these were not empty frontiers, but living, governed nations, deeply rooted in knowledge and kinship with the land. New voices emerged. Indigenous leaders, Black Canadian organizers, climate activists, and young innovators. And Canada, as always, wrestled with its identity. It remained a country of pluralism built on treaties, immigration, compromise, and contradiction. Its story was unfinished, but ever-evolving. From ancient glaciers to digital futures, from buffalo hunters to AI entrepreneurs, this is Canada. A land of memory. A nation of many nations. Canada's history is not a straight line, it is a braided river. Winding, complex, filled with collisions, convergences, and quiet revolutions. From the first footsteps across the Bering Land Bridge, more than 14,000 years ago, this land has been home to rich, diverse civilizations. Europe arrived not as a beginning, but an interruption. The Norse came and left. The French stayed, the British conquered. The dream of Confederation in 1867, linking sea to sea, was a political achievement, but also a colonial construct. In 2 world wars, Canadians fought not only for allies abroad, but for recognition at home. The 20th century saw Canada rise economically and culturally, gaining sovereignty step by step from Statute of Westminster to the Maple Leaf flag, from the Charter of Rights to a fully Canadian Constitution. Still, every advance revealed shadows. The residential school system, revealed more fully by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was not ancient history, it was lived memory. 60 Scoop. Quebec, proud and distinct, pushed Canada to answer hard questions about language, culture, and unity. In the 21st century, Canada has faced new challenges. Climate change, pandemics, political polarization, and reckonings with its past. And through it all, the land remains. Canada is not perfect. It never was. But it is layered, learning, and alive. It is the sum of ancient traditions and modern ideals. It is a story still being written by voices old and new, by debates still unfolding, and by dreams still to be imagined. This is Canada. It's not a finished portrait, but a living mosaic.